And when I see it go live here, do you see it going? I don't see it going, Stacy. Oh, there we are.
Nope, not yet.
No,
Where it's doing the commercial thing.
no, it's great. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we have a very special show on solar geoengineering, a subject that we have covered several times before, but this one will definitely have a different angle to it. And I want to welcome Luke Iseman. Did I say that right, by the way? Iseman? Okay, Iseman. And Luke's doing something very interesting, part of a company called Make Sunsets. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, I do want to say, everyone, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow us on YouTube and on Twitter and Bluesky now, too. So all those channels. And I also just want to say next week on next Sunday, a show, we have Carrie Browder from Prime Coalition and Project Frame, and she directs a program that helps clean tech investors figure out whether new clean tech companies are worthwhile investments from their climate point of view. For example, Make Sunsets probably might fit into that. So that'll be a really interesting show next week. But first of all, I want to welcome Luke. And Luke, to start off, you actually have kind of an interesting background. So why don't you start off and just tell us, before Make Sunsets, or sort of your path there, like what the kind of things you did.
It's kind of all over the place, or interesting, I guess, is another way to put it. I went to Wharton for business, applied everywhere but there for engineering, and grew up lower middle class, so deferred to my parents' advice for one of the only times, and became the first in my family to go to a fancy college like that. Quickly followed up by all of my siblings. So that was an adventure. I think I've tried to make up for the lack of engineering education ever since. Self-taught welding, variety of other, microprocessor stuff for a fun automated garden project that I did back in the day, and kind of just have been lucky enough to largely follow my interest, other than a couple years working more corporate jobs at building things at the earliest stages, and then occasionally helping others do the same.
Okay. And also you did some work, Y Combinator, director of hardware and things like that.
Yeah, I had a company that I co-founded go through Y Combinator. It was an automated gardening sensor, solar powered and Wi-Fi connected. Actually ended up eventually for sale in the Home Depot well after I left the company, but that was cool to see something that built actually on the shelf of the store that I frequent the most. And after that, basically just started volunteering at YC around the time that Sam Altman took over. He asked on one of our alumni listservs how YC could better support hardware companies. And having, largely self-taught and largely built on my own credit card, a variety of, metalworking, electronics shops, as in like a couple soldering irons and not much else, until I had, strong opinions on this, and way more usefully decided that there weren't that many hardware companies that had gone through YC, so I could just interview pretty much all of them, compile their and come up with some, basically what I wish I'd known 10 years earlier when I'd started building in hardware.
A lot of people might not know what Y Combinator is. It's an accelerator. It's something that takes startups and puts them through like a boot camp and gives them help, and in addition to money, right, to grow. And then the community of companies to get to work together.
Really useful advice, my favorite of which is their motto, make something people want. And for Make Sunsets, and for when I'm advising friends companies or past things I've started, I repeat what one of the group partners there said, that it's, really simple. You have to do two things. You have to make something. You can't just, have pie in the sky designs of what someday maybe you might create. And then part two, you have to show that people want it, whether that's getting them to download your app or use your social network, or, pre-order your hardware, or in our case, buy tiny bits of clouds to send to the
Right. So let's get into that. So you co-founded a company called Make Sunsets. And by the way, links to your page and to Make Sunsets is in the description there. So YouTube description so people can find you there. Tell us, what does Make Sunsets do?
So we cool Earth by launching reflective clouds into the stratosphere.
Okay, and a little more detail on that now.
Yeah,
We do in-depth discussions here on climate.
words, fair enough. I was very excited when I read Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock, a book about solar geoengineering, the field we work in. And in it, a Texas billionaire builds the biggest gun in the world, appropriate for Texas, of course, to launch cylinders into the stratosphere that then start burning sulfur to produce sulfur dioxide. And I'd vaguely heard that volcanoes had some kind of cooling effect, but as I dove into research after reading this book, I was stunned to learn how much that cooling effect can be. Stratovolcanoes, volcanoes that get a plume into the stratosphere, produce this disproportionate amount of cooling because of the sulfur dioxide that they put up there, basically stays there for 2 years because the particle's light enough and the wind's fast enough that it actually creates it's a 1,000,000x leverage, believe it or not. David Keith and other leaders in the field tell us that a gram of sulfur dioxide delivered to the right altitude from the right latitude offsets the warming from 1 ton of CO2 for 1 year.
I actually did that calculation myself, since I knew you were going to be on, and you mentioned that in some other interview you did. So I did the calculation myself, and I checked it with another solar geoengineering researcher, and it's correct. Now, it can give the wrong impression because the CO2 is going to warm the Earth for 500,000 years, or some of it will, and a lot of it will warm it for hundreds to thousands of years. And this is only 1 year. And
right.
So you're not really offsetting a ton of CO2 at all. You're just offsetting the warming effect, for a very short time.
Right.
But relative to the lifetime of the material. Yeah.
We always talk about ton years, and it's annoying because it's in the weeds, and it's also annoying because, as your listeners probably know, and you certainly do, most voluntary carbon offsets are fraudulent. NPR's number was 90% of the credits blessed by Vera, the biggest accreditor. So, one would hope that they at least skew towards less likely to be fraudulent. Basically, it's just this industry where people are buying a feeling, essentially. Like their voluntary is in the title. So it's been really gratifying to see that as of today, I think we're at 668 customers, and almost always individuals, a couple small consultancies and other companies just offsetting their 2 or 3 person office footprint. But this has been individuals who are, tired of the fraud with most voluntary carbon credits. I describe it as they stared into the climate doom by actually looking at the numbers, and then got out the other side and realized that we have measures that can buy us time until solutions mature is the caveated but accurate way to put how I think about what we do.
Okay. But by the way, I want to just clarify a little bit, because on this program, we talk a lot about sort of the 3 pillars of climate action. One is to get our emissions down to zero as quickly as we can. The second is to remove carbon from the atmosphere and permanently. And third is solar geoengineering, or what I like to call, we'll maybe talk about this, I like to call it sunlight reflection methods, because it's understandable. It clearly says what it is, and it sounds like something you'd like to do on a Sunday afternoon. So to me, it's better than those other terms. But when it comes to the remove carbon, you're right that a lot of the voluntary credits were for things like, I promise not to cut down a forest, or I'll plant a tree, which is going to die, by the way, when climate change gets bad. So it's going to be like the worst timing possible. But I just came from a conference this week on carbon removal. So there is a whole class of things actually being done at the very beginning of the industry right now. I mean, right now it's small scale, but real, where you actually physically take a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, permanently put it back underground, or turn it to rock, or do something that means it's going to be out of the atmosphere for a long time. Those are much more expensive to do per ton than planting the trees. And I think we're maybe hopefully in a transition right now. But you're right. For a lot of people were doing feel good kinds of carbon credits that were very inexpensive, but then again, not permanent. So that's a whole subject. We want to get to the solar geoengineering. So tell us a little more about physically how you do this, because we've had solar geoengineering people on talking about large scale airplanes, especially designed with large wings and big engines to get up into the stratosphere with tons and tons of material. What are you doing to put the sulfur into the stratosphere?
Yeah, we're the opposite extreme. We take a $200 weather balloon that can carry 1.5 kilograms of sulfur dioxide. We put sulfur dioxide into the balloon, then we add enough helium so that it's buoyant, and place a little sensor package below it so that we can tell how high it gets, and then we let it go. It's incredibly straightforward. It's so funny. I hadn't put this together until right now, but scientists will tell you, oh, but that doesn't scale. And in startup world, another of the slogans that people have, particularly in the YC world, is do things that don't scale. Like when you're starting a company, of course, step one can't be to do it in the way that's going to work into the trillions of dollars of revenue or megatons of SO2 deployed. That's not the point. The point is to start. And I would add as a pillar to your explanation of what we need to do environmentally, however people want to start, the measures you talked about are great. I think also climate activism can play a huge and in many ways more important than my work role here. There was the Just Stop Oil or the Climate Action Network, which helps fund, I believe, Just Stop Oil and other measures like that. Just linked to a report recently, someone, I think it was Stanford, compared the efficacy of donations to the big old traditional environmental groups versus to climate activism. And they found it was like 5 or 6x as effective to give dollars to climate activism per unit impact out.
No, I don't doubt that at all. We actually, on this channel, we also not only cover the science of climate, but also like, what about activism? We have communicators and psychologists and things like that come on and talk about those kinds of issues. That's interesting. So you have balloons. What do you use for the lifting gas?
We occasionally use hydrogen. Most of our launches have been with helium. And again, scientists and nerds in general will tell you, and they're right, that helium is a finite resource. We should switch to hydrogen sooner than later. And then other nerds will tell you that hydrogen is a greenhouse gas, so we should flare it or recycle, bring it back down and reuse it if we can, or some of it after the launch. And they're all right. But again, the point isn't to do this perfectly. The point's not to wait for Wake Smith and David Keith to finish designing and get $20 billion to build their fleet of high altitude custom airplanes. Those will be great. We have no religion around balloons. It's what makes sense at, the 1 kilogram scale. I am not as dismissive as Wake and others. I think that, I don't think, I've done the math. We can use the same balloons that NASA uses for large research missions that carry 1 ton of payload to the stratosphere per launch. And we can do, I think it's like 2x. It's between 1 and 2x, and I'll send you a link to the calculations on it. The number of flights that go through Atlanta International Airport per year. If we do that many launches with these existing 1-ton polyethylene balloons, then we materially cool the planet. I think that's to get us to negative 0.1 C from where we're at. For me, a big bet the company thing, and happy and increasingly looks likely that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to do this, is to get to where we do enough releases in a year. And again, this is far greater scale than we're doing now. But I think that the politics of this will shift within a year of us or someone else releasing enough SO2 to create a small but measurable drop in global temperatures. Then very quickly, I think this will stop from being something that most people don't know about, and most academics are hand-wringing about the potential geopolitics of, to, wow, we have this measure that can drop global temperatures by at least 0.5 degrees Celsius and keep them there. It'll cost in the high single to low double-digit billions to do that per year. Let's go. I think that shift will happen very rapidly. And frankly, I know something about startups, so that's the mode of operation that I'm trying to do it in. I don't think it's the best. I think that some international coalition holistically managing every layer of our atmosphere would be far better. I would not bet on that happening anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, by the way, I've said on the show many times that we talk a lot about solar geoengineering and how so many people are opposed to it. And I also tell people, I guarantee you we're going to do it because when things really get bad, it's the only thing that will have a fast response time to your actions. In other words, we cut our emissions as fast as we can. You might notice in 30 years that something happened a little bit, or if we do carbon dioxide removal on a massive scale, you'll notice in 30 years that things are starting to get better. But if you waited so long that the weather is horrible and heat waves and everything's terrible, the only thing that will work quickly is solar geoengineering. So I kind of say everyone's against it, and then we're going to do it. And maybe it's a little bit kind of what you're saying too. But so the big thing about what you're doing, as you know, you get a lot of pushback, and maybe rather than me suggesting what that pushback is, maybe you could tell us about the pushback that you're getting from, for example, people in the solar geoengineering community, the researchers. We had David Keith on just a little while ago, and we also had Doug McMartin on and others. So, but why don't you tell us the kind of pushback you're getting from the community?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously I'm biased. One of the things I've been most surprised by is that people in general just don't care. It's a really boring and really kind of depressing conclusion to reach. They don't care either way.
Wait. Which people are we talking about now? You're just about the public in general, you're saying.
Vast majority of people are like, what is this economy thing going to do next? Are my kids going to get some weird COVID variant? And how can I possibly ignore this shit show that is national, at least in the US, national, well, pretty much everywhere, national politics? Like, people are like, when I meet a normal person, like when I was in Salinas a couple months ago picking up balloon remnants plus our tracker that a lettuce farmer had found, he was like, cool. Like, one of my challenges is getting people to let me pay them when they find a balloon. In terms of, I'll get 1 or 2 emails or calls per week from some chemtrails person, which is like, honestly, just kind of entertaining more than anything. And yeah, like, things get blown out of proportion to try to make it a more exciting story than it is. The Mexican government has not banned solar geoengineering. The Mexican government said that they will weigh the pros and cons of solar geoengineering, which, I wholeheartedly agree with. Every country should do that. And when they do, maybe not on the first go around, but eventually they will reach the same conclusion that I have, that they have a moral imperative to immediately cool Earth as much as they can. I think that some G20 will realize that they have a strong economic incentive, both domestically, just in reduced losses to environmental catastrophes, as well as internationally, because an India or someone else can do this and then charge the rest of the world to continue doing it.
So, so what I've heard, and I've spoken to some researchers in the field, that what they're concerned about what you're doing. Well, let me sort of give the big picture. One is what you're doing now is not actually cooling the Earth in any measurable way. The output of a coal plant probably for 5 seconds is going to be more, cooling. And even though it's low atmosphere, only a week, it's still orders of magnitude, more scale. So you're not really cooling in any noticeable way. In fact, you're not really able to measure the effect. So this is not like an experiment where we're trying out to see if solar geoengineering works, because there's no MRV, as the phrase goes, measurement, reporting, verification, that you're able to do it. Actually, maybe I'm wrong, so we should talk about that. I know you try to tell that the balloon popped at a certain height, right? But you're not able to measure the cooling effect of what you're doing. And then the question is, and sometimes for startups, it's, hey, we have to figure out how to do this. Build an electric car, let's build a good one, and then other people can copy us, and then the industry can grow. But we actually know how to put, sulfur. We're figuring it out, with airplanes or other things. It's not, the question is not how to do it, it's getting the political will to do it, right? That's the thing. And then it boils down to, are you helping or hurting the deployment of large scale solar geoengineering? That's what it really boils, I think, from talking to people, what they're concerned. And their feeling is you're hurting it. So the cooling you're doing is insignificant, which you probably would agree, I think, at this point. Although you can say every little bit helps. But if you delay massive geoengineering by a year, certainly, but even a few days, then that would offset all the cooling that you've done by a massive amount in terms of warming destruction on Earth. So I tried to like summarize what I've heard from folks in the SRM community about what you're doing and why they're opposed to it. So I'm going to throw it back at you and let you respond.
I think that's the best summary I've heard. First is just, I mean, let's deal with it's too small to matter.
Well, to measure, by the way,
measure
specifically as well, right? You're not doing any experiment to see if it works, for example.
Right. But to be clear, no researchers are questioning whether SO2 creates cooling, regardless of tropospheric.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Agree that releasing the molecule I'm releasing creates cooling. So it's a very nuanced discussion. I switched from usually driving an F450, like it's an F350, but bigger and like single digit gas mileage, to usually driving an electric vehicle. And I have had 0 people yet tell me that that's bad because it is so small of a change that it doesn't matter. So implicit in that ivory tower criticism is that individuals cannot have an impact. I and anyone else trying to change the world would vehemently disagree, and I would encourage your listeners, whether they love or hate what I'm doing, to vehemently fight against giving up on the idea of changing the world in whatever way they want to. Also implicit in that Ivy Tower institutionalized criticism is that at some point, world governments will get their shit together enough to do this. I don't know that. I know that by doing something, I'm doing something. And I'm not going to sit here like, I mean, what really made me vehement about this is seeing what happened with ScopeX. And your listeners probably know, but this was David Keith, brilliant scientist. No one would dispute that. Also, quite friendly when I've spoken with him. In spite of having a philosophical disagreement with me about whether startups should be involved in this at all. He had a project at Harvard called ScopeX, funded by Bill Gates, kind of like the dream team of brands and people that you would want for responsible adults doing this. And they just officially canceled it earlier this year after almost a decade of 0 deployment. They were going to do a small test flight with no deployment, followed by a scheduled 1 kilogram deployment of chalk dust. A misguided coalition of environmental activists, some of whom now are admitting that we should at least research solar geoengineering, by the way. So like, we can't have a bigger barrier zooming out to taking action to try to solve a problem than those who are creating and in fact accelerating the problem face. That it's easier to do a new pipeline that, Willow Ridge or whatever, the giant new installation in Alaska went in quite smoothly, but Harvard scientists with Gates funding can't deploy 1 kilogram of chalk dust. I mean, that's if that contrast doesn't, 1, make people angry, and 2, spur them to want to take direct action, then, I don't know what will. But certainly I'm not willing to sit back and trust that the responsible adults have this handled, because they're our ancestors and they're the ones who got us into this situation.
That's a good answer. But talk a little bit about your theory of change. I mean, I think you'll agree that, okay, I mean, just like driving an EV lowers your carbon footprint a little bit, but I think we can all admit that one person lowering their carbon footprint won't change the path of climate change in any even measurable way, except like theoretically in the math, if you get down to many orders of magnitude lower than what's happening. So assuming that the governments don't get their shit together, and it's we're putting it on your shoulders here to do something, do you see your projects scaling up? I mean, again, using different technologies. Do you see a path where what you're doing scales up versus you do what you're doing for a while until governments take over and actually start doing this on their own?
I mean, we are about a third of the way to profitability. On a per launch basis, our balloons are profitable with about 60 to 70% margin. And my biggest cost is helium. When I switch to hydrogen, that margin will double. So, flipping from the grandiose change the world stuff to the reality of a business, we're a third of the way to profitability. And profitability is a really boring economic concept, but what it means is that we can continue doing what we're doing indefinitely and in fact accelerate it. And that's super exciting to me. Whether that means that we accelerated 1,000x per week, unlikely, obviously. Like, look, this is a startup. Most startups die. They're extremely high likelihood of failure and extremely high consequence if they work. So we're like at the extreme of that extreme, obviously. But that said, like I can see, we've done the math on doing this with balloons. We are also of the basic for startups, but apparently crazy to academics, that if we've been doing this for going on 2 years now, and then in a couple of years the government's like, oh shit, we need to do this. How can we do this? We have more deployments than anyone else, so I think at least they'll entertain letting us do it for them. Yeah, I mean,
well, one airplane's going to launch more cooling than you've done in your cumulative thing even for years. I mean, you're up to about 1 kilogram now, right?
Oh no, we're well over 50 kilograms.
Oh, I meant per launch, but yeah, okay, you're 50 kilograms, yeah, in total. Okay. And airplane's going to do multiple tons, right?
It's this thing that
well, then maybe not the first prototype plane. I mean, you can take a Learjet, by the way, today and get up into the stratosphere and put some.
You can't do it at. If you could do that, we would just be doing that. You can do it near the poles.
Yeah, correct. In the poles, right. Yeah.
We focus on deploying. Basically, we want to be San Francisco or closer to the equator. People used to think you had to be near the tropic. Some of Doug McMartin's more recent modeling indicates there's less sensitivity, so we can be, I think, up to like 30 or 35 degrees north or south. And yeah, if we could get up there with a plane, we would just do that now, which you can, to be clear, but you need like a MiG or something else. A MiG, I don't know the name of it, but they can apparently, even previous generation ones, their afterburner goes out, but if they do like a full speed at an arc, afterburner goes out and sometimes doesn't reignite, so it's like a super risky. They can actually get to the stratosphere at the altitude, at the
at the troposphere, yeah, mid latitudes, yeah, okay, yeah.
And I very much like that. If a billionaire with a spare fleet of MiGs is listening, happy to help them declare war on global warming and literally use the same tools that were built for war to release SO2 bombs into the stratosphere. Like, I agree that's a better way to do it. If someone has that plane, like, the problem with that is similar to the problem with space mirrors. Like, that is a better way to do this. Using a custom high altitude plane to deploy is better than what I'm doing. And space mirrors at the Lagrange point are better than using a plane. The barrier to doing that is that it doesn't exist and we don't know when it will. When we deploy space mirrors, I will happily stop my startup and go back into semi-retirement.
Okay, we actually have, one of our co-mods, by the way, has done a lot of research on the space mirror. I think it's not on right now. So Well, speaking of that, so in our discussion with Doug McMartin, we talked about like one of the reasons to do solar geoengineering right away without delay is to try to prevent an Amok collapse, right? And Amok is everybody listening here probably has heard us talk about Amok collapse, Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that brings warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, and it's slowing down and could shut down. And the quick answer is if it shuts down, all hell breaks loose because it just shifts weather patterns around the world, lowers rainfall in the entire northern hemisphere. Northern Europe goes into a deep freeze, and really bad things all over the world happen. And it's caused by melting Greenland ice, which is fresh water going into the North Atlantic and also into the North Atlantic and also Arctic water. And so if you freeze the poles, then you're going to prevent that fresh water. And then you might have a chance, by the way, not guaranteed, by the way, but you might have a chance of preventing an Amok collapse. So I think there is an emphasis on the Arctic, and I'd like to hear from you how you chose your region and what's the thinking and the science behind the regions that you're picking to put the cooling.
Yeah. First, I just want to take a second to stress that reasonable scientists are telling us what is, I think, the original paper that hasn't been retracted said, what, 50% chance of collapse by 2100? Or it was a double chance of Amok collapse.
Yeah, we covered it multiple. We had 3 scientists on here so far talking about it. And it's, well,
yes,
I don't know about the 50%, but they said from 2025 to 2095. And so like 2050 is sort of the sweet spot there. There's actually, and that was a statistical analysis. There's been several different types of analysis, not just statistics, looking at the physical models and all this kind of thing. And everyone is going, well, at least we shouldn't be assuming it's never going to happen. I mean, it's a real serious threat that's not being taken seriously at all. It's being almost ignored.
Yeah. So again, if people aren't spurred to, and it doesn't have to be solar geoengineering, but whatever treating this as an emergency is for them, it's mind-boggling.
Totally agree. That's what we cover on the show a lot. I mean, that's what the show is about almost, that people are not taking things seriously. We try to.
Yes. Why focus on our latitudes of deployment rather than Arctic? Per unit delivered to the stratosphere. The hard thing, as I'm sure you've heard from others, is getting things to the stratosphere. So SO2 deployed per gram from our regions creates substantially more cooling than deployed directly at the Arctic. So when we get to the stratosphere with a launch, the particles actually settle out after around 2 years near the Arctic. They enter the Brewer, I think it's called the Brewer-Dobbs circulation. So, yes, and I think is like the improv role, yes, and is how I think about climate action of all sorts. Yes, we need direct air capture. Yes, we need to refreeze the Arctic. I think where I would differ with a lot of academics or policy people is on whether, I mean, look, there's a 50-50 chance that we elect a fascist who doesn't believe in climate change again in one of the wealthiest and the most powerful country in the world. And people are going to tell me to just calmly wait and the governments are going to handle it.
Okay.
Yeah, they can do that. I don't think that is a particularly uplifting or likely to work strategy. So yeah, yes, and yes, we need government action.
Well, there's also in the issue when you do it in the lower latitudes, let's say near the equator, for example. I mean, so one of the problems of global warming, I mean, of the many millions of problems that it causes, is that there's Arctic amplification. So the Arctic's warming faster than the equator, and therefore the temperature differential between the equator and the North Pole and South Pole is dropping. Oh, I'm sorry. It's very cold, and now it's getting warm. Yes, it's getting warm. So the temperature differential is dropping, So let's see, if you cool the center, you're going to make a bigger differential. I'm thinking about this real time here. It's just because that's what's making the jet stream be lazy and slow, and that's what's causing all the crazy weather. When you get these crazy heat waves, crazy cold snaps, and that's because that temperature differential is dropping. If you no, I think you want to cool. I think you want to cool the Arctic. It's gonna accelerate that differential.
I mean,
Right? You're gonna, yeah, even a cooler equator will make the warmer thing, make the warmer differential.
I know
Right?
that modeling tells us to ensure to ensure that we're not disrupting weather systems at scale, like when we're doing this at 0.5 degree Celsius or 0.75 degree Celsius, which, to be clear, we're talking about offsetting more than half of the warming since the pre-industrial revolution with just this measure in the, high single to low double-digit billions of dollars.
Well, I totally agree. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is staying below the threshold at which David Keith and others will tell you we're worried about things like stratospheric heating. This is basically doing a Pinatubo per year, or a Pinatubo and a half, and continuing to do it. If we only need, according to the modeling, we need 6 to 12 launch sites, some of them northern hemisphere, some of them southern hemisphere, to ensure that we're uniformly creating cooling and not disrupting existing weather patterns.
Exactly. You got to do that too, right? You need it on both sides.
Yeah, insanely low cost and small number of launch sites for the impact that will have.
But you wouldn't propose balloons for going forward. I mean, at a large scale. So let's talk about the lifting gas. You said helium, that's problematic if it's hard to get and it's a limited finite resource, as you mentioned. But hydrogen, as you also mentioned, is a very powerful indirect greenhouse gas. It's not a greenhouse gas on its own at all. It only has 2 atoms, and so it can't really vibrate the way it needs to trap heat. But it does destroy it does bind with the molecules that destroy methane. And because of that, and I did a calculation because I couldn't find on your site, but I use about 1.4 kilograms of hydrogen in a small weather balloon. Does that sound about right to you, by the way?
Yes.
So if you do that and you do it for 1 year, just 1 year, the GWP, the global warming potential of hydrogen in 1 year, is 106. In other words, it's 106 times more powerful than the equivalent weight of CO2. And so that would give you, for every balloon you're essentially launching 0.15 tons of CO2 at the same time. But the thing is, CO2 lasts, I'm sorry, you're doing cooling for 1 year, whereas the CO2 effect, let's call it CO2 equivalent effect, essentially forever. But if we look at 100 years, the global warming potential is 12.8 for 100 years for hydrogen. And so you do that over 100 years, you get 1.8 tons of CO2. So if you were only launching 1 gram, which you're not, you would be offsetting the warming effect of 1 ton of CO2 for 1 year, but you would be creating 1.8 tons of CO2 of warming for 100 years.
Assuming that we don't reuse the hydrogen.
Reuse, okay, that's cool. How do you reuse hydrogen from a balloon in the stratosphere? That's cool.
Project Loon broke like all of the records for stratospheric ballooning. This was Google's balloon internet thing. And one of the many interesting elements that they and others have done, like you can compress hydrogen to reduce the size of we have not built this, and it's going to be years until we build this. Might not, because planes, including several French startups that are building supersonic planes that will be capable of the types of flights we need, by the way. But one way that one might do this is to compress hydrogen into a storage tank on the rather large balloon to reduce the volume of the balloon and the effective lift.
Okay, so not balancing, but compressing it so it sinks and then you expand it.
Exactly.
And that's what they were doing, and that's the kind of thing you would. I see. Okay. Yeah.
Even more exotic stuff, or at least got patents on some of it. like generating hydrogen in flight from electrolysis of some amount of water, right? Like there's all kind of crazy stuff you can do. One of the less fun challenges for me as a co-founder of this is to not go down all of the fun technical rabbit holes, because there's basically infinity of them, and to focus on, okay, what do we do to get this to the next step? And for us right now, that's keep launching with helium, even though it's expensive, even though it's finite. Eventually, when we can fully account for it, more fully switch to hydrogen to drop our costs, and then demonstrate larger and larger launches, and by demonstrate, what I mean is have paying customers continue to fund. Like, we launch based on customer demand. We actually have a backlog of like 6 kilograms to deliver now. We had a couple good months recently. So people talk about things very differently. Some in the foundation, like philanthropic community, are talking about research launches of several tons, and they think it's important politically to talk about that as a research launch. It's not my world. Good for them. I hope it continues to work. We do deployments at the kilogram scale, and kind of the language doesn't matter. Like, what I would ask is how much SO2 is getting delivered to the stratosphere. And I've told people working on this as much. If someone tells me that moving a launch or delaying a launch will in some way maybe benefit their research deployment or other effort, and has any data behind it, I'm always happy to do that, and I've done it in the past.
Well, I mean, I think what's going on, and I'll try to play the role of these other researchers here, having spoken to them. Again, as you can probably tell from speaking with me, I'm very pro doing SRM. I mean, I wish we didn't have to do it. I mean, I wish we had, done things long ago. And big objection to SRM, which we should talk about too, is that it has negative side effects. It could, I mean, not at your scale, but if it did scale up, it could change monsoon seasons and things like that. And my answer to that is, yeah, sure. Now compare it to the side effects of not doing it, and you'll see that those are orders of magnitude, at least an order of magnitude, if not orders of magnitude worse. And we know what we generally know what those side effects are. That's why we're thinking about SRM, right? So, but that's a big discussion in its own right. I think the biggest objection is that these SRM researchers don't think what you're doing is very harmful. It's too small to even notice compared to the 100 million tons we put in the lower atmosphere every year that contributes, it's not on its own, but it contributes to the deaths of about 8 million people a year, right? So fossil fuel pollution is what causes 1 out of 5 deaths, and there's not a word spoken about this. It's very strange, actually, that when the leading causes of death is not even mentioned, it's not even discussed at all. Harvard study that estimates it, but that's about it. But so they're not worried that, oh, you're screwing up the atmosphere or anything like that. And by the way, I think there is an argument with if you were doing hydrogen or the balloon, if you really added it all up, that it's not just your 1 gram of cooling. You have some warming effects, the whole process of making the balloon, whatever it might be. And at this tiny scale, maybe those things actually are pretty big, actually. But it's only when for example, when you have a airplane that is dumping multiple tons of sulfur into the atmosphere, it also has engines that are giving off CO2. But I think those calculations show that it's really a tiny amount compared to the cooling effect of the multiple tons of what's happening. So I'm trying to say that I don't think they're saying, oh, what you're doing right now is screwing up something physically, like you're not screwing up the atmosphere. They're not saying anything like that. I think what they're saying is that people are, as you are probably aware, that people are very concerned about SRM in the first place, irrationally so. Okay, you've seen these petitions. We shouldn't even do SRM research, let alone deployment. I mean, it's pretty crazy. And so they know that getting this to move forward is not a technical problem. It's a political problem or social problem or a combination of these non-physical things. And they think that what you're doing is messing that up. It's creating a lot of publicity around it, not really a lot of cooling around it. But the publicity part is going to delay actual deployment, actual research by, again, if it's a day, it probably would have a negative effect. So that's what I think is the real crux of why people are concerned about what you're doing. And you kind of talked about it before, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that particular aspect.
I'll suspend false modesty and speak a little bit about what has happened in SRM in the last 12 years versus the last 2 years. And almost all of the activity is in the last 2 years. And whether you give my actions or Neil Stephenson's actions for writing, I mean, this is kind of one of those ideas, like when you look at the history of invention, it's like the great man theory versus the time and place. I've on the time and place side of that. There have been so many close to at same time in different place inventions. It's not just Neil Stephenson's plots. It's like 3 or 4 other sci-fi authors. Ministry for the Future is the first other example that comes to mind. Cory Doctorow mentions it. Another friend and author mentions it as well, all within a year or two of each other. So, give them credit more than me for inspiring this. And David Keith will agree, I think, with this. And I think several other researchers are quoted as saying they don't know why, but in the last several years, now Environmental Defense Fund has decided that they're going to have a committee to talk about someday maybe doing something about this. Several of the founders of Extinction Rebellion have called for researching reintroducing sulfur into ship emissions, which is an eminently horrible idea.
I know. It's pretty funny that they would.
Things are moving quickly. I think any argument that by doing this, I've slowed down research or slowed.
No, not research, but the eventual deployment of large scale. Let's put it that way. The eventual deployment of large scale SRM.
Several heads of or highly ranked people at, I think there was a departure from Sierra Club and a couple other of these environmental NGOs have left to private philanthropic foundations specifically to head up SRM research programs. You've seen the Degrees Initiative take off. Again, like obviously this isn't from any conscious or skilled planning on my part, but this has all happened since our launches. And
you might argue that the publicity of what you're doing has just raised general awareness of this, and then the more people look into this, the more they get excited about it. Is that the general frame you're trying to present?
Yeah, and like whether it's our efforts or anyone else's, we don't have time to listen to the experts tell us that someday maybe us taking action might have negative consequences. You could use the same argument about climate activism, and it would be similarly misguided. We start doing things by doing things, not by trusting the experts and the adults in the room to someday maybe do them. Frankly, that thinking, I think, on, call it the left broadly, while the right paves literally and figuratively over the world, though that let's think about it versus let's take action, even though it's imperfect, but is clearly directionally right. Fast forward 1 million interactions like that, and I think that explains largely how we have gotten into the social and environmental problems in the US and increasingly worldwide that we have. We don't have time on the left for careful contemplation. We are past time for action when we know it's directionally right and without relying on any centralized groups to do it for us.
And you mentioned that there are private groups actually that are supporting SRM research and trying to move it forward. Have you had discussions with folks like Silver Lining, for example? Or
yes, that we are receiving no financial support from any of the mainstream green foundations or research groups. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I applaud all efforts in this space. I hope that people focus on building rather than critiquing, and I will try hard to do the same.
Okay. And let's talk a little more specifically about your business and what it would look like to a person wanting to work with you. So how much do you sell a cooling credit for? And how do you describe that credit, by the way? Maybe say it one more time, but like specifically, if I'm signing up on the dotted line here to buy a cooling credit, what am I buying? How much am I paying?
Yeah, so the price is between $10 and $1. And buying one cooling credit is a commitment by us to deliver a gram of SO2 to the stratosphere. And we link to the same research that you've talked about and my own calculations to verify it, just like you did, on our website, explaining that both with SO2 and with CO2, there are uncertainty windows. I was surprised to find an IPCC footnote after hours of research explaining that the mainstream consensus on warming per gigaton of CO2 emitted, there's a 3x difference. Expert consensus is that 1,000 gigatons equals between 0.2 and 0.6 C of eventual warming. Again, uncertainty is not a reason to stop action. We know CO2 emissions create warming, so we should reduce and recapture CO2. The modeling on SO2 actually looks tighter. The biggest range I could find was a 2x difference in the mainstream models for amount of cooling per unit SO2 to the stratosphere. So,
Let's say it again. Repeat that again. What did you say?
Mainstream estimate of warming per ton of CO2 is a 3x difference between 0.2 and 0.6 per 1,000 gigatons emitted.
Okay. And it's a lot more at the surface, by the way. I'm sure you're probably aware of that. If the terrible way we do it of emitting it in the lower atmosphere, but that also helps create clouds. And that's why the shipping, reduction in sulfur from shipping was so large, is because it wasn't just the reflectivity of the sulfur, which is what the main effect is in the stratosphere, but it's also seeding clouds, creating new clouds, making clouds last longer, making clouds brighter. And all that together is I don't know if it doubles it or something. I'm not sure. But that's why when you bring it up to the stratosphere, you actually need more than you think from just the lifetime difference, which is what you might think, 1 week versus 1 year. You do need more than that. Yeah.
Impact to temperature impact, it's about 20 to 20x more effective to deploy in the stratosphere than from ship stacks. Actually, after
Wait, say it again. Repeat that.
Say it again. Per gram of SO2 deployed from a smokestack on a ship versus in the stratosphere, it's about 20x more effective to do it from the stratosphere from a temperature impact perspective. And I can link to the.
Okay, I heard exactly the opposite. I think it was Doug. I hope I'm not speaking for him if I'm wrong, but Doug McMartin was telling me that you needed twice as much in the stratosphere to have the same cooling effect as that amount in the troposphere because of the cloud effect that you don't get up in the stratosphere. So there might be some differences in research there.
Literally just deploy from the troposphere. Like I would literally just open up tanks of SO2 and solve the problem. I'm 100% certain it's very much the opposite. And I had one of a foreman scientist check my numbers before publishing this. Yeah, it's over 20x more effective to deploy from the stratosphere. That's why we go through all of the work on this, and that's why there's the whole field of stratospheric aerosol injection. Otherwise, we'd just do it from the troposphere.
Well, again, it's wait, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, I'm saying this wrong here. Okay, yes, you get a yes. I want to correct something. You get roughly a 50 times improvement, roughly speaking, because you have a year, or maybe you say 2, but let's just call it a year, 52 weeks, instead of 1 week. So you would think that you should get a 50 times improvement, but you only get half that, which is, I guess, a 20 times improvement. So yes, I'll agree with you. But what I meant to say is that you lose some of the effectiveness because of the cloud problem. So another way of putting it, instead of 100 megatons that we put in the lower atmosphere, we need 5 megatons in the stratosphere, which actually totally agrees with what you're saying. So I misspoke. What I was saying that I didn't take into the time element, which is 50 times longer, but you don't get 50 times, as you say. It's about 20 times.
Yeah,
right?
part of this is real quick, big numbers get involved and lots of numbers, and it's entirely understandable for anyone with it.
No, I'll tell you, wait, what's going on here? But and by the way, I hope today this discussion is not only an interesting discussion for viewers to hear what you're up to that maybe never heard about you before, or to hear about the pros and cons, and they can take their own side, but also to learn a little bit about solar geoengineering and what's involved. I mean, this calculation I did, the 1 gram, let's say it again because it's really mind blowing. 1 gram. I mean, there's 1,000 grams in a kilogram, so 2.2 pounds, right? So 1/1000th of that in the stratosphere will cool the Earth, offsetting the warming of 1 ton of CO2, which is 1,000,000 times more of CO2. However, it's not really as good as it sounds because that CO2 is going to warm and warm and warm and warm. And we had a researcher on long ago talking about the carbon cycle and saying that some of the CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for 500,000 years doing damage. I mean, that's not the original amount. I mean, that's after it trails off. But yeah, so cooling just for 1 year, when you buy a cooling credit for $1 to $10, you're not offsetting a ton of CO2. You're off, and if you think of it as 100 years, you're offsetting 1/100th of a ton of CO2, something like that.
Well, I want to push back on that, the 100,
Okay.
because it's not. I'm pushing back in the opposite of the direction you'd think I would. When people are like, "Oh, buy this tree planting," they're assuming a GWP 80 or 100 typically, and that tree is not lasting for 80 or 100 years. So I think any conversation about CO2 impact should be ton years. If you're
Say that it should be 10 years, you said?
ton years.
Oh, ton years. Okay.
Overly technical, but it's intellectually dishonest to talk about it any other way. With the direct air capture, if you're capturing it as a gas and pumping it somewhere and expecting that tank not to leak, then congratulations, you've invented something that humanity has never ever had before, a container that doesn't leak for millennia. So again, yes, and we need all of these measures, but we should be intellectually honest in how we talk about them, which is why we are always talking about warming effect of a ton of CO2 for a year. And the 4 year is extremely important because otherwise it's not an honest evaluation of what a technology is doing that impacts carbon.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, when it comes to trees, yeah, we had Kevin Anderson on the program actually a number of times, and a quote from him is, "Plant trees for good tree reasons. Don't plant them for carbon reasons."
I love that.
And so yeah, and I guess you're in the voluntary market, and people are spending what 1,000,000 times more than they spend on you, or on trees, which are, I mean, good things. It's good to plant trees. There's nothing wrong with that, but you shouldn't think that you're sequestering carbon for a century or more, which is, by the way, usually the threshold that if you're having, quote, permanence, that CO2 you put away is going to be away for at least 100 years, if not 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. And that can be the case, getting back to the real way of carbon removal, not the cheap, make you feel good way, which you're talking about. And that is to actually pay to get a ton out of the atmosphere and stick it back underground in a saline aquifer where it's not going to come out for, 1,000,000 years or something like that, or turn it into rock, which has the same effect. There might be very, very, very slow weathering on the rock, but that's over thousands of years. So it can be done. It costs way, way more. And I guess even if you ran yours out for 100 years, let's say it was $1, 100 times that is $100, and now you're in the same realm as carbon removal, right?
Right, except we have our impact. Important to note, and this is probably overly technical for most people, but there's an implicit discount rate. And the higher your discount rate is, the less you value future life, the more sense it makes to do something expensive and slow like carbon removal. the more urgency you place on this and the more that you think that actions we take now from a temperature perspective matter more than actions spread out over 100 years, which is obviously how I feel, the more you should favor measures like mine, like any change in reflectivity is action now, not spread over 100 years.
No, I agree, by the way, but I think well, now let's get to the other subject you must be asked about a lot, and that is, yes, we could cool the Earth a lot. Right now, if we put those airplanes up there and for $5 billion a year, we could bring the temperature down by a degree or, in that order of magnitude pretty fast. And we know it'll work, as you said, because Mount Pinatubo did it, and we can mimic that. The concern people have with that is that if we rely on that and not the other things, well, obviously, I won't even spend the time on the moral hazard argument with you that if we do this, then we won't do the other things. Let's just throw that out the window, assuming that we have serious climate action. But if we don't take that serious climate action fast enough, like really work at seriously removing carbon, we are going to be relying more and more as the temperature warms up on sulfur to keep us cool. And then something happens, your company goes bankrupt or war, whatever it might be, and we stop doing that. Then we have termination shock, as you're well aware. So how do you address that to people ask you about that?
Yeah, I think this is one of those arguments that sounds good at first glance, and then you think about it more, and it is patently absurd that we might take some action to, okay, let's zoom way out and be very blunt, and we'll look at the mortality cost of carbon. There's a Nature paper from a couple years ago. Your plus my lifetime emissions mean that someone will die of heat-related consequences because of our lifetime carbon emissions between now and 2100.
Each individual person, by the way, to make that clear. Yeah, right there.
So it's like 2.3 times average American's footprint. So you plus me, basically. Yeah. Probably a little less because I fly a lot. So my footprint's larger. In contrast, if we instead, for some amount of time, do stratospheric aerosol injection, we are preventing warming for some amount of time, whether it's a day or 100 years. It matters, the more the better. But to not do it because we might someday stop, that's literally not preventing extinctions and saving lives, because we might someday stop preventing extinctions and saving lives.
Well, I think yeah, first of all, I agree, and that's usually how I answer it as well when people bring this up. But I think the concern is not that, because another way of saying it, look, you would have had all that warming anyway if we hadn't done it. So why are you worried that all of a sudden you have it again? I think it's that it will be essentially almost instantaneously added. And so instead of we're going up incredibly fast now by 0.2 degrees a year. I mean, it's an insane amount. But we would literally go up a degree in a year if we had termination shock. And that would, and I don't even know the science behind how that's so much worse than a slow ramp up. But I think that's the idea. Have you looked into that? It's the sudden amount as opposed to the slow amount.
The easy answer to this is don't stop until we get our carbon emitting addiction under control, right? Like, yes, I agree that it would be bad to start and then stop. It is far worse not to start. Like, it is quantifiably worse. We're doing a disservice to the world to not use this tool to create cooling. And by the way, I very specifically mean we, as in like people with enough time to tune into this live stream, who I'm guessing skew to Western and more than zero disposable dollars. This is not an India and China problem to solve. It is at best jingoistic to, I love the research behind Climate Brink, and I think that it is at best like the recent post about, hey, don't be sad, we can hit net zero by 2050 is jingoistic, because they're only talking about it is a rounding error to say that all carbon emissions in the atmosphere are from Americans and Western Europeans. We created this problem. It is on us to solve this, and to deny carbon emissions to people with darker skin than us as their societies develop is racist / wrong broadly.
Mhm.
To have a
Yeah.
slight political rant there. So anytime you see, oh, we can be net zero by 2050, they're talking about America only, and that's literally that's smoking hopium is how I would put it. And I think it's incredibly
We talk about that here. Kevin Anderson, to quote Kevin Anderson again on his last interview with us, is that net zero is Latin for kick the can down the road. Yeah. So, yeah, net zero. We talk about that. I mean, we have to get there, but by talking about it, that kind of means you're not acting now. We have time. We'll do it later, whatever, and that's very dangerous, of course. Yeah. So let's change a little bit here. Well, I should let other people ask questions here. So by the way, if you're in the audience on Zoom, then, and by the way, if you're listening on YouTube and you want to join on Zoom, then you need to join our Clubhouse room to get the link to Zoom, because we can't post the Zoom link out in public. So that you can do for future interviews. If you are in the audience and have a question, raise your hand. We also will go start off with Stacy, one of our co-mods, to see if she has a question. Hey, Stacy.
Hey, Dan. Hey, Luke. Thanks for being here. I have my
Thanks.
sunset attire on, I want to thank you for being here, because you have given me I'm totally the action. I am so tired of talking about it. I want that change in our cities and on streets and stuff. It's like everyone is driving everywhere and no one will stop. And I will do anything to stop the freaking driving everywhere. And then the same, similarly, we are the problem. The US, Western Europe, it's like, we got ours. See us, suckers. They don't get to try and advance their societies. And still, even when you look at it on a per capita basis, it's obscene. We are the most, it's like, oh, we've reduced ours because we are absolute gluttons, So it's like, oh, we trimmed down to 4 gallons of ice cream a week, it's, whoa, good on us. I think you and Dan went through this, but if you could just recap for me one more time. Like, I know every little bit helps. And when you're going in the, yours is going into the troposphere versus the stratosphere versus the troposphere. What is that math, or that calculation or math, how does it work out? Like, okay, our balloons do this, it's 1 kilogram at a time, and they do this for this long. If we had the planes, it would do this for this long. Could you boil that down again?
What we do is we just go on a gram by gram basis, and whether we're delivering it from planes or from balloons, Dan's absolutely right that at a larger scale, we should do full life cycle analysis for this, because it is so leveraged, even with our mode of delivery. Like, let's take a recent, yesterday we launched 3 1-kilogram balloons. That is both the weight of the balloon and how much SO2 it can carry. 2 of them confirmed made it. 1 we overfilled and had an experimental plane to fly back to us on and did not make it. So for the 2 launches that got there, it was about 1 kilogram in each balloon. So 1 kilogram is 1,000 grams. Each of those balloons will offset the warming of 1,000 tons of CO2 for 1 year. If instead we just opened our SO2 tank and let out that same quantity, it would be about a 20th as much cooling impact.
And the lower atmosphere. Yeah.
We just opened the tank right in the park that we were in. And to be clear, very detrimental effects to human health, acid rain and other consequences. I don't understand the chemistry of it. Part of it is the quantity and part of it is the altitude of release. But one of my favorite comparisons is I had a scientist check my numbers on a post I did called Move Smoke to Cool Earth. If we just take the sulfur that we saved from requiring boats to have cleaner fuel a couple years ago, and every year put that quantity of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, we actually don't know what would happen, because it would be about 2.5 Pinatubos per year. It would be well over 3/4 of a degree Celsius, and it would be likely far more than we need. So if we just take that quantity or a small proportion of it, and instead put it into the stratosphere, we drop global temperatures materially.
Yeah.
I was also thinking in your like, oh, how many crazy spin-offs can I try out here? Is should we go like to LA or last year to Canada and like just blow the smoke up higher or something from all our forest fires? But I guess that, you know,
Put fans under the forest fires and blow it up.
the energy would
Stratosphere is very high up, by the way, so not really possible.
Right. There was a question on YouTube about does sulfur dioxide affect the ozone layer?
Yeah, so there is a meaningful but slight negative impact on ozone layer. If we do, I think it's if we do 3/4 of a degree Celsius per year of cooling, it's something like a 10 to 15% likely reduction in ozone. That's less than half of what we had in the 70s. So we have a slight reduction in ozone, which means an increase, I think, in ultraviolet light that reaches the surface that is partially, but I think not fully offset by our, the increased particulate in the stratosphere that we'd be creating. So yes, a downside, long answer short, a downside of using sulfur dioxide is a reduction in ozone layer, according to most of the models. People got really excited about chalk dust 10 years ago and then stopped 5 years ago because modeling showed that using calcium carbonate is even worse for the ozone layer. So we use SO2 for now. We're not religious about it. There are the challenge to tell your chemist friends is that you want a lightweight, reflective, non-reactive, cheap particle. And there are many, many, many candidates for that, from the absurd, like diamond dust, through newer, easier to form nanoparticles that might actually, and I'm not touching these till we're much further along, that might actually not fall for many, many more years because they're so lightweight that, and I forget the term, but gravity isn't the dominant force on some of these. So, we invest as a world, like at all. Like if we treat this like the Manhattan Project that it should be, honestly, we skip all of this bullshit and go straight to space mirrors, right? That's the right way to solve this, but for the, $1 trillion odd startup costs and the political consensus necessary to actually do it.
Well, speaking of that, is Eli,
well,
do you
I was gonna say, but the last one is Elon. Can we just put it in the Falcon tanks?
From
network.
Some friends have launched CubeSats and their cost per kilogram is far higher than ours. Like if I were to buy luggage on a Falcon launch, I think it's something like 100x greater than.
But it's not Falcon. You do Starship, and Starship would be like the 10th the cost of Falcon or something per pound.
Yeah, I think that's still, it was like comically higher than ours.
Oh, okay.
It's a different.
I guess I was thinking, why can't we use that as, I guess there aren't enough of them to sort of replicate the ships, but like.
No, 200 airplanes, remember? Doug McMartin. It's 200 airplanes that are modified cargo planes with bigger wings and bigger engines so they can just fly up higher. Normally, you'd never need the cargo plane to fly in the stratosphere. Why would you ever need that? And it would be such a waste. It's not that you can't do it. It's just there's no reason to do it. And but then you.
But what about just like a fuel additive in the planes that we have?
No, it's way too low. Not too low, but
that might be one way that this happens. With some of the upcoming
chemtrails.
Yeah,
that's what chemtrails are. Let's do it for real. Their contrails, by the way, do have a slight. Is it cooling or a warming effect?
It depends on when you're flying, where you're flying, time of day, time of year. I know, that's why I want to get the cloud guy on here. But thank you. And I should let Eli go because he will have lots to talk about.
So Eli, our other co-mod who's worked on space-based SRM. Are you there, Eli?
Yeah,
okay,
thank you.
Go ahead.
First, a quick comment on the last comment. Diamond nanoparticles actually would not be at all impractical. In the late 80s or early 90s, I heard a story of a scientist hearing that the Soviets were really good at synthesizing nanodiamond, and so he wrote to them and asked them for a small sample, and he was expecting, a vial with a few milligrams, and they sent him a kilo. And it turns out they were using this as solid rocket propellant.
What?
So,
Wild. Cool.
Wow.
so not at all impractical. I've actually thought about specifically this, and then there are some other different aerosols we can talk about offline. Yes, I've been looking at space-based solar, and I kind of want to update your acronym a little bit, Dan. Not solar radiation management, not sunlight reflection methods, but sunlight reduction methods, because that
I don't know. That sounds negative compared to reflection, by the way. I think
well,
from a regular person point of view, they're not going to like hearing that.
maybe. I mean, when you understand,
You're still reflecting it, or you're reflecting it way out in space.
Well, okay, so reflecting or deflecting, because diffraction actually gives you a little bit of leverage, depending on how you model it, and I need to get better modeling methodologies, because the last modeling methodologies was giving way too high enhancement. You can get like an 87% bonus most likely. So anyway, to step back, doing space-based sunlight reduction is totally avoids any interaction with atmospheric chemistry. Whether you're talking about iron fertilization or stratospheric aerosols, it's like we've got to advance as a species from solving problems through hopeful chemical dumping, I think. And the real advantage, actually, of doing this in space is that you get much more fine-grained real-time control. There's an off switch. There's an off switch that can be effectuated in minutes, right? So that totally blows out the argument that, well, what if there are unintended consequences, right? Well, we can deactivate. Now, in terms of practicality, I've gone really deep on figuring out, is this viable? Is it viable short term? The answer to both is a resounding yes. And it actually, even with rather conservative assumptions, turns out to be an incredible bargain, even compared to stratospheric aerosol injection.
Okay.
Well, okay. I will state, a couple of important assumptions there. One is that, and I validated this through calculations, that Elon Musk was not smoking anything when he came out with the $10 per kilogram launch cost. It works out that when you figure out the cost of fuel in 2017, when he said that, inflation has changed this, it was a little less than $9.50 per kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit. I'll get to the difference between low Earth orbit and Lagrange point one in just a moment. But even with the Starship launch architecture, $10 per kilogram is not unrealistic. You might have to adjust a little bit for inflation. In terms of what you would really do if you were doing this at scale, is you would do a totally different launch architecture, which would give you various advantages, which are too technical to go into right now. But the point is that $10 a kilogram is not at all a fantasy.
So Eli, by the way, we could do a whole program on space-based solar, but today we're talking about the balloons and what Make Sunset's doing. Do you have any questions or comments specifically for Luke on his approach, or maybe is good, what's wrong or something?
So let's see. You did a really good job, Dan. You hit the points that I was raise, and I was also going to raise the one that Stacy brought up of add mixing a little bit of aerosols into rocket fuel. I don't think that is like a game changer, but I don't think it's irrelevant either. The nice thing is that it's a good way possibly to get some short-term leverage, which is really what we are talking about in terms of any kind of SRM, because the real answer is to remove, clean up the mess that we made, remove the excess carbon from the stratosphere. So all of those points were hit. Really, I'd like to ask, in terms of when you've talked to people about this, what say you achieved some more quote milestones unquote, and say we add to that that you did some optical measurements on like trails from your balloons, right, to show that, look, in this region at this time, when we infer that the sulfur dioxide is at this concentration, we're seeing this much optical attenuation. Therefore, when it's diluted, we can expect that much. And I'm kind of also suggesting that this is maybe something you do. I would imagine you've thought about that, and maybe you could comment about that. But
well, let's one at a time. So let's, MRV, are you planning on doing any measurement, reporting, and verification of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so what we focus on is confirming quantity, altitude, and latitude, because as we've discussed earlier, no one serious disputes that SO2 creates a cooling impact, and we'll do more as our customers drive us to. We have a standing offer to scientists if with our couple kilo max per launch payload, if there is useful payloads we can fly or ways we can change our launches, we're happy to. But that's going to be driven by scientists, not by us. It's frankly over our head, one, and two, I think that's the right party to be doing the science versus the deployment of things that we know work.
Okay. Any other quick questions?
So yeah, where I was going with that is, say you had more of that, backing you, or as part of the case to be made. Do you see the funding that goes into this, people purchasing offset? Do you see that increasing? What kind of growth rate would you think is not unreasonable?
I mean, we deploy based on customer demand. To be honest, we're only spending, we're behind by several kilos now. We deployed successfully almost 2 kilos yesterday. We're going to launch a 4-kilogram balloon for the first time later this month, and that will take us maybe 3 or 4 hours at most, because I'm stingy in trying to run this as lean as I can. We're literally working out of my co-founder's RV. So assuming we get a large order and I stop shuffling tanks every launch, we're easily deploying, I mean, hundreds of kilograms. With our current architecture, we can easily deploy hundreds of kilograms per month. And really our only limiting factor at this point is customer demand. If someone places an order for a ton, we'll get it up within a couple months.
Oh,
okay.
A ton.
I just wanted to quickly mention this. If you're coming down to LA Tech Week on Friday, I'll be giving a talk on space-based solar radiation management.
Oh, cool. I don't think I'll be there, but I'm excited to see more research happening on that. I was proud to donate to my buddy's work at the Planetary Sunshade Foundation, and I think we need way more efforts on space-based stuff in general.
Great. Thanks, Eli. And Jim, wait. Jim, give me 1 second here to get you ready to ask your question. Okay. Now you should. Hey, Jim, welcome.
Yeah, hey.
What's your question for Luke?
Yeah, good to see you guys again. Hey, Luca, have you looking at aircraft? I just looked up like a 1960s Learjet has a service ceiling of 45,000 feet, and then I looked up where the stratosphere starts. It's at 23,000 at the poles. So a 1960s Learjet would get you well into the stratosphere, and they're really inexpensive to purchase because their fuel mileage is really bad, and there's a bunch of them out there. I mean, they're almost being scrapped. Have you? Well, first of all, what's the minimum altitude? Why don't you consider aircraft that go already 20 something thousand feet into the stratosphere, which are readily available, that can carry tons of weight? So I guess my question is, what do you consider the stratosphere? And then another part is, why not the poles? The delta T.
We talked a little bit about this earlier, but
yeah. The poles are more important. So that's What about aircraft that you can buy right now really inexpensively?
Yeah, again, the stratosphere is far lower at the poles. It's something like a little more than half the height. So you're right that a Learjet could do this at the poles from my limited understanding of aircraft. We've focused on efficacy per gram, but yeah, there's definitely a strong argument to be made if people want to focus on the poles, and if someone wants to let us borrow their Learjet, I'll need 6 months to actually get the pilot's license and probably a little more to do it safely, but that's certainly something we'd be happy to do. My focus from the start has been on efficacy per gram deployed. And
you're saying that it's more effective around 35 latitude?
Yeah, you have to be closer to the equator than 35 to get the long residence time. I think it's like 3 to 6 months, if I recall correctly, if you deploy at the poles. So you get 1.5 to 2 years if you deploy to the stratosphere from south of 35 north or north of 35 south. You have to get, it's not always 20 kilometers, but at 20 kilometers at any point on Earth, you are in the stratosphere. So we just round up to that. There's maps, it took a while, but you can find a map of, like, given weather conditions on a specific day and location, a rough estimate of the technical height of the tropopause for where you are. We don't, we'd rather just deploy well into it and round up. We're actually, weirdly for a startup, undercounting. If we can't confirm that our balloon made it to the stratosphere, like if telemetry fails or we're just not, basically if telemetry fails, we don't count it, even though it very well may have gotten there. And even though deployments in the troposphere obviously have some slight cooling effect. Same with if we go further into the stratosphere, like our average for our two that made it to the stratosphere yesterday, they were I think they were average of about 30 kilometers height. So over 10 kilometers into the stratosphere, that creates more cooling. I haven't seen good modeling on how much more, so we don't charge for it. That still counts as the same as a deployment right at, it's binary for us. We get into the stratosphere and the cooling credits are deployed, or we don't and they're not, and we relaunch. Does that make sense?
My guess is that there's not enough known about circulation patterns in the stratosphere. Aren't there rotating cells, and if you can get into there, it'll lift it up? Or are you just counting on just gravity taking that molecule back down?
Yeah, we're not relying on anything other than if we make to stratosphere, we count it as deployed. If we're further up, then obviously it's some amount more effective. And I think you bring up a good point that there's not enough known about the stratosphere. The tagline is that we know more about the bottom of the ocean than we do about the stratosphere.
Yeah. There's some really good nullschool.net, that planetary satellite thing that's updated every few hours. Cool. You can do stratospheric weather patterns on that.
Awesome.
Yeah, get up there.
And Jim, by the way, the newer planes can fly even higher. I think they can get in 60 65,000 feet. Some of these G500s, the new ones.
Right. Yeah. And you're way up there. The other thing is, why bring SO2 up there when you can burn sulfur? Because that's how they make SO2 down here. They burn it. It's another thing to look at.
That's a good question. I've asked some of the lead researchers on some of the plane projects about that. They pushed back. I was originally thinking that I would literally just do a sulfur burner, and then others can use that on their planes when I get to large enough balloons to justify whatever weight for the burner plus whatever metering mechanism to confirm that I'm not just putting up chunks of sulfur powder, but actually releasing it such that given the oxygen levels, I'm burning it slowly enough. And it's basically a 50% weight savings because SO2, the sulfur weighs twice as much as the oxygen.
Right.
They said that they thought the complexity of doing that. I'm not convinced either way, but I had been convinced it made sense. Now I'm, one of the many things.
You might want to look at YouTube on how they make sulfuric acid.
Okay.
What you do is you heat up the sulfur. It turns liquid at 140 C, and its minimum viscosity is at 200 C. And they just burn it in what looks like a big old afterburner and make the SO2. And then there's another operation to make the sulfuric acid. But you could run liquid sulfur in an afterburner on a.
I think there's the advantage of your simplicity so far. Just put a teaspoon.
Of
sulfur into the balloon and fly the balloon.
I think if you get an order in the hundreds of tons of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, you could then look at the aircraft way of doing it. It'll bring you up.
So Jim, thank you, and appreciate it.
Yeah.
Let's see. It's 1 second. Okay. So with that, Luke, I don't know, any final thoughts you want to tell our audience? We had a great discussion, I think. And again, I want to repeat that I wanted people to, first of all, understand what you were doing and whether they love what you're doing or hate what you're doing. I just also wanted to make sure that they learned a little bit more about solar geoengineering. And I think we've accomplished that today. But if there's any thoughts you want to leave with our audience, please go ahead.
Yeah, check out our website, Make Sunsets. Whether, to echo your point, whether you support or hate what I'm doing, take more action on your part. We got ourselves into this mess, and we can get ourselves through and out of this mess via direct action and application of technology. We kind of have no other choice.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. A really interesting discussion. I've learned something as well, as I always do on these programs. And I want to remind people, next week we have Carrie Browder from Prime Coalition talking about how do we figure out what climate solution companies are the right ones to invest in. A little different subject than we often cover, but a lot of interesting nuance to that question, actually. So I think that will be a great discussion. We'll also learn more about what Prime does, which is a philanthropic organization that's trying to drive climate action. So there's a lot of other interesting things they do. And please subscribe, like, tell your friends, follow us Twitter and Bluesky, and the links to Luke are down in the description below. And thanks for coming, Luke. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.